Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Tanaschuk, and I'm the executive editor of Homeland Security Today. And we're very excited about bringing our audience the first in our webinar series with IBM Center for the Business of Government. We reached out to the center earlier this year because of their tremendous work on the Future Shocks Initiative and a subsequent book, Transforming the Business of Government: Insights on Resiliency, Innovation, and Performance. And we really wanted to work with them to apply what they were learning and what their participants were sharing with a focus on the Department of Homeland Security and Homeland Security missions across the federal enterprise. So to that end, we've partnered to bring our followers a series of columns and live webinars to explore some of the, quote, future shocks facing our homeland and discussions around how we can prepare and mitigate these impacts. So huge thanks to the IBM team for their work on this important initiative. And of course, Dan, you're huge and instrumental in that partnership. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Christina.
We're here today to discuss climate resilience, sustainability, and homeland security. And we have with us to discuss, of course, Dan Chinook, who's the executive director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government. And I think many of you know Dan, so I don't know if, they're just bored with hearing your bio, but Dan oversees all of the center's activities in connecting research to practice to benefit government, and has written and spoken extensively around government technology, cyber security, privacy, regulation, budget, acquisition, and presidential transition. Mr. Chinook previously led consulting services for public sector technology strategy, working with IBM government, healthcare, and education clients. So we're always happy to work with you, Dan, and I know you have such a following around town, so we're honored to be here with you. We also have Sunny Westcott, the Chief Meteorologist of the Infrastructure Security Division at CISA at DHS. We had the pleasure of getting to know Ms. Westcott at a Women in Homeland Security luncheon and found out that CISA has just this amazing cheerleader for making sure that we protect our critical infrastructure against every possible scenario. She specializes in national extreme weather hazards and climatological studies for impacts to public and private sector key resources. During her time in the U.S. Air Force as a lead meteorologist, she trained on continental and oceanic weather as the top forecaster for her support region and is considered a subject matter expert for multiple climatological events such as drought, subsidence, wildfires, tropical cyclones, and winter storms. And finally, we have Chris Mim, Adjunct Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, and the former Managing Director of Strategic Issues for GAO. And Chris, I don't know if I told you, but GAO is like one of my favorite places. So, I'm just so glad you're here. I love what you guys do, or did. What you did there. As an adjunct professor at Syracuse, Chris teaches graduate courses on public administration and democracy and performance management. He's the former managing director at US GAO, where he led GAO's work on governance, strategy, and performance issues. He's also a fellow and former board chair of the US National Academy of Public Administration. So I don't think we could have a better team to start talking about this. So Dan, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about future shocks and how that's looking at our challenges for securing the homeland.
Well, thanks so much, Christina. Thanks to you and to the Homeland Security Today team for the opportunity to join two stellar speakers in addressing this topic. I'll give a little context and then turn it over to Chris and Sunny for the bulk of the time, and then we'll look forward to answering questions from the audience as well. So as Christina said, the center that I run at IBM, it's sort of a think tank, an independent organization inside the company that does research on topics of interest to government leaders. And the research ranges from technology topics like artificial intelligence and cloud computing, but also topics around financial management, government procurement, program management and delivery, sort of any issue that would be a challenge or opportunity for a government leader falls within our bailiwick. And as we've all lived through the last 4 years, about almost 3 years ago, we said, well, what can we learn from the shock of the pandemic and the sort of corollary shocks that the pandemic saw out in terms of supply chain, workforce issues, sort of population staying at home, effects on climate, et cetera. What can we learn from this experience that can help governments, both in the US and around the world, be better prepared for events and emergencies that can affect not only this country and the homeland here, but also homelands around the world? And how can countries work together more effectively in doing that? And we partnered with the National Academy of Public Administration that, as Sunny mentioned, Chris is a fellow and former board chair. I'm also a fellow with the Academy. And we said, as well as with the IBM Institute for Business Value and other international organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and we said, what are things that governments can learn from one another? What are ways that governments can take lessons from one crisis and carry them forward to the next so that they're not reinventing the wheel when a new crisis occurs, which often happens? And then importantly, what are things that happen in one area of the economy or of governance, let's say supply chain management, that could be lessons learned for other areas, let's say cybersecurity or emergency management? Oftentimes, communities in responding to crises kind of do really well in working with their own peers and allied organizations, but there's not as much kind of cross-sectoral learning. And so we set about a program where we met with government leaders and experts in the US and also around the world through a series of about 10 or so meetings over the course of a couple of years. And we basically put to them the challenge of how do we help governments move forward in these different areas: supply chain management, cybersecurity, workforce management, emergency management, and the topic of today, climate and sustainability response, in terms of the shocks, not just that we saw in the last 4 years, but really in the last several decades in terms of climate change, its impact, how governments can best prepare going forward. And we produced from each roundtable a paper that basically laid out the key challenges. And then we put all the papers together in a book. And that's actually that book that Christina and the Homeland Security Today team saw, Transforming the Business of Government, that really summarized a lot of the key learnings from this initiative, where we dealt with future shocks and how you can address future shocks more effectively. And that led to the series that we're kicking off today. So thank you, Christina. And that kind of brings us full circle to the topic of today, which is one of those 5 domain areas. Again, sustainability, climate change, how governments can move forward, and importantly, given our partnership with Homeland Security Today, how these issues really affect our ability to prepare for, respond to, and be resilient in the face of different kinds of events, whether they're man-made, whether they are natural. There are still effects that can impact the homeland in many different ways. And so how do we address that in scope? How do we help governments build capabilities, work with the private sector, work with civil society? Those are the kinds of questions that we got into and that we'll be talking about today. Chris Mihm is the author of several of the papers that came out of these roundtables, as well as the compendium document that kind of summarized key themes across sectors. And Chris was the author of the climate and sustainability paper that went into the compendium as well. So I'm going to now turn it over to Chris, who is a great ally and friend of our center and a great mentor to me and to many in government over many years, to take us through the report. And then we'll turn it over to Sunny for reflections on her really unique and fascinating role at DHS. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to Homeland Security Today. It's just a real delight and honor to be with you today, and with Dan and Sunny and Christina and everyone who's on the webinar, and look forward to the conversation, the questions that we'll get into shortly on this. I think as a starting point, we all have experience either working in or for or with large government bureaucracies. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, government bureaucracies. I mean, these big institutions at any level of government. And they often serve us, very well in terms of being able to deliver routinized, predictable, and standardized products and services. And when they, if that's the case, that is the routinized, predictable, and standardized, they generally do a pretty good job. And so, for example, mail gets delivered, tens of millions of pieces of mail every day. Passports get processed and approved. Social Security checks get delivered into people's bank accounts. All of this is good, and it's a sign of effective government for this routinized and predictable and standardized. The challenge that we face, the challenge that you all face in the Homeland Security environment, of course, is that what happens when in an environment of shocks? That is that, we're existing shocks to the system, where they or emerging ones or cascading that will have, impacts in interconnected ones, where they are cross-cutting and boundary spanning by nature, and boundary spanning both by geography, by professional discipline, by agency jurisdictions. In short, what happens when the response cannot be routine? It is not predictable, and it cannot be standardized, and those approaches do not work. Well, unfortunately, what we see too often is that the system seizes up, or there's a complete breakdown. As Dan mentioned, this was in many ways one of the going in points that this project on future shocks between the center, the National Academy of Public Administration, and Dan's colleagues in IBV at IBM. So when they convened us together, they wanted to answer those three big questions that Dan asked us or mentioned right at the beginning. Underpinning all of that, though, was a sense of what are the capacities that governments at any level, local, state, federal, even international, need to have in place to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to and recover from future shocks, these shocks that aren't standardized and routinized and predictable. And so, as Dan mentioned, they convened a series of roundtables. There were about 200 different participants across the roundtables of a national and international audience that took place across various topical domains. One of the things that came out very clearly from all of the roundtables, and including, of course, the one dealing with climate sustainability issues, was that the traditional management categories apply. I mean, that they're still relevant in non-routine on non-routine issues, on future shocks, on these so-called wicked issues. And so you still have strategic planning. You still want to make sure that you have performance measurement and data and evidence-driven government and stakeholder engagements and workforce planning and budgeting and risk management and the rest. The challenge, though, obviously becomes when we're dealing with these cross-cutting problems, when we're dealing with these cross-cutting shocks, is that these traditional management categories reconfigure in new and more dynamic ways. And that's what the Future Shocks Initiative was about, was attempting to catalog, based on experiences of the experts that were at the roundtables, and synthesize their experiences into a set of 8 imperatives and then a set of 40 or so action items that they suggested the governments at all levels think about and put in place if they want to make sure that they are able to respond to future shocks. Obviously, in the interest of time, I won't go through all of those imperatives, won't go through the action items, but just to touch on a couple of them to give it in the context of Homeland Security, to give you a sense and or a flavor of what we were talking about. And so for the first actual imperative was build a governance mechanism for future shocks. And so what this was about was making sure that as we are putting together a networked approach to dealing with complex issues. As one participant put it, is that our response to complex issues needs to be at least as sophisticated as the issue that we're attempting to address. So as we're putting together networked responses, what we found is that the successful efforts are very intentional in picking the collaborative mechanism, the network mechanism that they're going to use, and then making sure that that is systematically and carefully managed. In other words, it's not just a call for people to get together and let's kind of work on an issue, and then after a variety of a period of time, things go away and we all get back to our day jobs, as it were. But rather, it's making sure that in thinking through what is the mechanism that we're going to use, whether it be a task force, a working group, and they all have a czar or czarina as the case may be. What are going to be the leadership strategies or approaches that we're going to be putting in place, and then making sure that that is then carefully managed. Is there clarity of mission, clarity of roles and responsibilities? Who's going to do what and when in the event of the crisis? What type of information will be collected by whom and at what level of detail and quality? Now, all of this, given that it's a crisis, can't be all entirely prefigured ahead of time. But to the extent to which that we can get a lot of that done, or a lot of the thinking and building relationships of trust ahead of time, where the principals and people that actually know each other, we're going to be very well positioned. One of the people I thought put it very, very well. It's actually an old line that probably many of you, I may have even heard it from someone on this webinar years ago, is that the center of the crisis is not the time to be exchanging business cards. And so we need to make sure that we have a governance mechanism in place. The second thing that imperative that they focused on was planning to mitigating cross-cutting shocks. Now, we're all involved in in strategic plans in our organizations, performance plans, and all the rest, and various process mapping. That still is very important. But when the issue is cross-cutting in nature, again, across various boundaries, that means the scope of strategic planning needs to expand appropriately to manage the scope of the problem. And so strategic planning then becomes not just within a central or a single organization, but rather it becomes focused on a particular issue. So it's not a Department of Homeland Security strategic plan, or it's not exclusively a Department of Homeland Security strategic plan. It's rather one that looks at the broader issue, seeks to understand who the various players are, seeks to get the performance metrics in place, how we're going to know, how we're going to measure progress, seeks to get that network in place that I mentioned just a moment ago. Again, the traditional management category of strategic planning still works. It just evolves and reconfigures in a more dynamic way. And then the final one that I'll touch on, just in so that we'll have time to get to, obviously plenty of time to get to Sunny and then Q&A, is the importance of public participation and communication. One of the things that came out loud and clear to us, especially in the context of disaster response, climate-related disaster response, is the importance of having effective communication strategies that just don't speak in terms of government language, just don't speak in terms of technical language, but rather use, as one participant put it, storytelling in order to build understanding and with the various communities. So it's not just one kind of story that's being told, as it were. It's a variety of different stories appropriate to different types of communities, so that we can both communicate to them, but also equally important, hear back. That there is active listening on the part of government, on the active listening on the part of the members of the entire members of the network, so that they can make sure that they are both communicating effectively and hearing back. Likewise, in terms of public participation, and especially at the level of when we're discussing adaptation strategies, of making sure that we're building off of local knowledge, that we're involving the public, again, at all levels, and to all aspects of the community, in participating in what sort of adaptation strategies will be put in place, how will those be implemented, what will be the effect of those on various communities. This is good, just obviously as a right of kind of from a standpoint of small d democracy. You want to make sure that the people are involved in adaptation, but it also guards against maladaptation. That is making sure that we're putting in place strategies that are actually going to be effective, that we're building on local knowledge. Again, what these 8 imperatives were designed to do was to think about what are and articulate what are the capacities that governments at all levels need in order to be effective in responding to future shocks, and the action steps were designed to help governments move along those lines. It's been just an absolute delight in working with my colleagues on this. But the full credit of this, of course, goes to the 200 or so participants in the various seminars. The usual academic disclaimers apply in this case, is that anything that was valuable that came out of that, it's the credit to them. And obviously any conceptual mistakes that remain are my responsibility solely. Again, thank you very much. And Dan, I'll turn it back over to you to head over to Sunny.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. And you really did a great job tying together a lot of the themes, and credit to you for, relative to today's topic, for bringing these together in a paper specifically related on climate resilience, which will set us up for Sunny's presentation around her work at DHS. And in that roundtable, we talked about various versions of the imperatives that you just described relative to climate sustainability action around capacity at the local level being one key imperative. Thinking cross-boundary, climate issues don't stop at any particular border. Looking at public engagement and thinking about the differential effects of climate adaptation on different communities, the equitable distribution of those effects, and how they might differ in urban and rural, different levels of income, communities, that sorts of things. Leveraging opportunities for resilience, building climate resiliency into city planning, regional planning, transnational planning at the borders. Thinking about the green energy transition and looking there. So all of these climate-specific issues were coming out of the process that Chris described, and really led us into a mode of, climate resilience is an important Homeland Security issue. And it's with that understanding that we are thrilled to turn the floor over, the virtual floor, over to Sunny Westcott to talk about the great work that she's doing at DHS, and that can lead us into discussion. So Sunny, over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. So I do have slides that I believe are going to be thrown up here, and with these slides, I know I'm mobile right now, so I wasn't originally anticipated, but being able to roll with the dice as we go through everything. So what we're going to talk about with the slide deck that I've presented is a lot about how this agency interacts with all of our stakeholders to be able to say there are impacts that are occurring across all of the critical infrastructure sectors. They have an impact that can range anywhere from the heat and the rain all the way through to these extreme storm systems, the severe weather, the tropical cyclone shifts, even some seismic activity variants that's starting to occur that's interlinked. So what we're going to be talking about is just going through some of those main key points and then how they interact within each of these infrastructure sectors. So as you can see, I originally started out my graphics showcasing where we're at this year, and that black line is where 2024 is against the 10 hottest years on record. So that really showcases where we're standing already in the extremes, is that we're not only breaking the mold, but we're standing so far away from even the years that we had anticipated to be our worst years, that this year is really showcasing what future years can start to look like when it comes to these pain points. If you go on to the next slide, a lot of what I do in the agency is consume all of the physics, all of the science that I can get my hands on, and I synthesize it down in a way that makes sense to our stakeholders. And through that, I get to talk about upper atmospherics, I get to talk about surface impacts, I can talk about geology, the different topography features that play a role in these systems, and then of course where their sector sits within all of this. So I usually showcase an understanding of the upper level physics, which is these millibars. Our storm systems form from the top of the atmosphere down to the surface, with the exception of tropical cyclones, which is why they're so disruptive, is they actually form from the surface and then try to expand upward. So when we have this understanding of the upper level of the atmosphere and what's growing, what's worsening, it's these low pressure systems and the changes we're seeing in them. So if you move on to the next slide, you can see that these low pressure starting at the top of the atmosphere down to the surface, if they get deeper, they get lightning strikes, snow events, the main shifts in our temperatures. Picnic days, is to think of them, they're solar radiation at too long of a time period now, too much heating. There's also too much in the way of stagnant air. There's less wind flow, and that amplifies out some of our wildfire activity. So on one side, you have flooding, severe weather, hail, lightning, tornadoes, and on the other, you have drought, wildfire, and heat waves. So when you see a change in either of these two, you can see how that would immediately cascade to everyone at the surface needing to change their operations to match that pain point. If you go into the next slide, you'll see what that looks like as an interlinked effect. So you can see slower moving low pressure systems. They can change the way that we're seeing those damages to our aging infrastructure. So we know everything that we built in the 1900s. That means that it was already starting to break. Just if you take a sledgehammer to a wall and you smack the wall, it may be able to take that initial hit, but can it take 200 hits plus? Can it take those hits while you're also heating up the material and weakening it? Eventually that damage starts to show through. And we're seeing that with all of these different cascading weather events as they amplify. So being able to make sure that our stakeholders are tracking that, tracking what this means for their sector, for the supply chain, for other countries. Just because it's changing here in the US, that does not mean that we're the only ones seeing these impacts. As you saw in the last graphic, all of these highs and lows move across the entirety of our northern hemisphere. So any change in one area is being replicated in the next. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that this is how I break it down within the agency. I take our 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and I looked at each of the ways that weather was impacting them, breaking down the overall shifting that we're seeing in the atmospherics into 8 main weather events: sea level rise, severe storms, drought, flooding, wildfires, tropical cyclones, extreme heat, and extreme cold. So when I talk to them, I'm making sure that they understand that, yes, we're saying that even a small variance in heating comes with all these cascading effects, that they're still tracking, they'll still see winter events, they'll still see their rainfall. We're not saying you won't get rain, we're saying you're going to get all of your rain at once. It's going to be too much, too fast for what we've built our infrastructure to maintain within. We built for seasons, and we're not going to be seeing those same seasons when we go forward, not in the same intensities or longevities. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see the graphic that was put out from NOAA that breaks down all of our different climate from the beginning of the 1900s to where we're at now in 2020. And you're able to see all of those 30-year increments, and you're able to look at where were our roads built, when was the metro built, when was the airport built, the grid system put in, when was my home built, when was the critical infrastructure site established, against this entire change that's occurred from the early 1900s when we made these plans When we started looking at implementing and buying supplies and picking the variances in the intensity of our supplies in the mid-1900s to the full implementation in the 2000s and what that looks like as the temperature continues to grow. So we know that the hotter it gets, the more humid it gets. That has a direct impact on material stability, whether it's through the metals, the steel that we use on our bridges, whether it's through cast iron support for the bridges, concrete, cement mixtures for the roadways. The same thing with our building materials for our homes, our roofs, our sidewalks, the cars. If you move on to the next slide, when we talk about this impact and how it's occurred historically and why some of these are becoming more damaging, the real concern is what's coming. We know that we've created a tidal wave and that we're riding it now, but how much more of the tidal wave can we sustain before that damage becomes unbearable? So when I look at the damage field from extreme heat and drought and heavy rains, you're able to see that certain parts of the US suffer different pain points first. That isn't to say that any one part of the US is immune from others. We had Tropical Cyclone Hillary make its way up the West Coast into Montana last year. So not to say that anyone can actually look at a tropical cyclone for the continental US and say that I'm avoiding having to put that in my mitigation planning because they don't happen here. That's not the case going forward. Looking at Alaska with Merbok and Mawar, looking at Hawaii, they didn't even need to have a tropical cyclone pass them. They had an amplified wind field from a tropical cyclone nearby, coupling with a high pressure event that was already stagnated out in that area. So needing to understand why these events are worsening and where they're worsening and the different changes that that can have at the surface. If you go on to the next slide, you can see how the amplification in these weather events can yield a greater turn in the ecology of the region. So if we see wildfires burn through an area, we're able to communicate, okay, there's a wildfire, we need to do response, we need to do ops, have to move firefighters, supplies, water. When we look at what happens when you lose that leading tree, you immediately have exposed weaker trees on the back end. What does that mean for sustainability? You end up losing your soil retention, you lose your air purification systems, you lose your wind force breakup mechanisms. And when you look at all of these, as we continue to see the amplification, you see that the West Coast and the East Coast fire frequency is doubled. And in the Great Plains, it's quadrupled. So when we're looking at some of these states, looking at New Jersey, Texas, Oregon, Hawaii, and others that have all reported record-breaking wildfire activity over the last 2 years, that cascading threat becomes very real for their emergency response because now they're leaning on other states, other countries for resources, for staffing, and then the next state already on fire again. And we're seeing this as the major trend as we go forward is what's growing back on the back end of these wildfires is not the robust tree that just burned out. It's a sapling that cannot handle the same level of drought, wind, flooding, that mature tree that just died off from the fire was able to do. That creates an additional cascading threat of what's growing back in on the back end of these wildfires. How do we mitigate it? What do we plant? How do the flow of the water? Are washes getting out of hand on the back end of these? So if you go on to the next slide, taking into consideration that change in rainfall across the region, the next slide covers down from NASA this visual on evaporative demand versus heavy rainfall versus heavy snow. Changing your water through the water cycles and monitoring that is so critical because it's not just a flood event. It's not just a heavy snowfall event. It's not just, oh, everything's getting hot and it's evaporating out. It's going, the rain comes, area, then evaporating out. It's creating too much hazard in the frequency of intensity. If you go into the next slide, that's really coupled up with our tropical cyclone conversation. So I know when we talk tropical cyclones and climate change, we're often saying that the cyclones are getting stronger, the wind, they're able to grow fast, they're able to produce significantly more rainfall totals in the initial onset of their landfall. They're also producing tornadoes. So look at one of these correlated features to looking at what happened with Alaska, with Merbok and Mawar, looking at how all of these systems are changing from that mesoscale down to the local scale is how we're able to communicate to stakeholders that they need to be considering planning for emergency planning, and to be able to start looking at how we're funding what resiliency moves on the back end of each one of these weather events. If you move on to the next slide, there's the conversation about sea level rise, which obviously has an impact with each, or it's the tropical.
So Sunny, you're breaking up considerably. Can you hear me? Maybe if you turn off your video, it could improve connectivity because you are pretty much inaudible for us.
So Christina, while we're waiting for Sunny, I did notice in the question, there was a, did you resolve that question that we will be able to make the presentations available, or we're going to check on that?
Yes, yes, we're checking on that. I'm pretty sure Sunny said yes, but we just want to make sure.
Okay,
Absolutely.
and then just as we're waiting for Sunny to log back on, just a reminder to please put any questions in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to address them.
Dan, this is Chris. Just again, while we're waiting on, sorry. Let me get back on. There we go. While we're waiting on Sunny, I mean, just to underscore one of the points that she was making, and it came up as well in our sessions, our roundtable sessions, about this was on her fire response point, about how localities have, through interstate compacts, have very often, had agreements with other localities in the event of a forest fire, that they would be helping each other out. As climate change, the risks escalate on that, is that's no longer going to be a viable option in many cases, because you're going to have multiple fires, in various areas at the same time. We saw that a little bit in the Canadian situation a couple summers ago, where Europeans had to return back to Europe because of fires. I believe it was the Spanish fire service had to go back there. This is an example of why it's so important to be having that planning ahead of time, so that you know where your vulnerabilities are, you know where you know where your risks are, and that you're not making assumptions of, oh, if something goes bad, we'll be able to rely on so and so, where they may be thinking the exact same thing about you, and in either case, it's not going to be viable. And so, just wanted to point out that that's she gave a particularly vivid example of the more generic point that we were making in the roundtable.
I think that's an excellent point, Chris. And while we are still awaiting Sunny's return, just a point. So Sunny's office sits in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, which I think shows the importance that the Secretary places and the administration place in this, creating this new role at DHS to demonstrate that that climate change does affect many things, including there's a strong connection between climate risk and resilience in cybersecurity. You think about power, the power enablement of that's powering a lot of the servers, sort of in the cloud computing servers that may sit in rural areas that may be subject to risks of wildfire, that sort of thing, or in urban areas that may be subject to flooding. There's a lot of different points of connectivity that we discovered kind of in both our cybersecurity roundtable and in our climate roundtable, in terms of the connections between making sure that we have a sustainable approach to computing, to energy, to power, and the viability of those critical infrastructures over time, which are critically important to the functioning of all of our lives as citizens of the country. So sort of tying together a lot of these different themes really underlies the importance of why Sunny's analysis is so important for DHS.
No, and that's an excellent point. And it's, as we also heard, is that in many cases, especially at the local level, is that they don't necessarily understand all their vulnerabilities. Because they obviously, the obvious ones that would be there, but they may not understand the full mapping of what would be the consequences of something, of a fire somewhere else could take down their technology in their particular area, or if they're a flood in their particular jurisdiction could have an impact many hundreds of miles away. And that's not a knock on any local government. One of the big things that we heard was that just that there isn't an awful lot of capacity down there, is that these chief resilience officers, chief disaster response officers, they are completely overworked and inundated. And so it's just a matter of making sure that we at the federal level, state level, and even international level are helping them and supplying them with the tools that they need to be successful. And I see Sunny's back, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, that's great. I think we've soft shoot enough that Sunny, we're going to kick it back over to you again.
Hi, marvelous. We were on sea level rise last. It looks like I apologize for that. Jumping cell towers is a whole process. So we're gonna just move back into it. So what we're gonna do is the sea level rise and the impacts to the immediate of the electricity. If you go on to the next slide, the main reason that we talk about the electricity sector is obviously we need it so desperately for all of our critical infrastructure that when we talk about the severe storms increasing, the tropical cyclones, the heat waves, the flash flooding events, we're also looking at lightning strikes going up. The high heat, high instability is allowing for some of these thunderstorms to produce stronger hail events. They're producing larger hail, but it's also doing more damage. Strikes are doing more damage for wildfire activity, but also for power outages on transformers. We're looking at more straight line winds, which is also amplifying damage to our transmission lines, our buildings, more downed trees. So you can see how each one of these events within themselves is problematic. But when we talk about Tornado Alley and we talk about the shifts that we're seeing in the baseline temperature, the contribution of moisture from the Great Lakes, from the Gulf, from the Mississippi, from the Tennessee and Ohio River valleys, all of that warming up is allowing for tornadoes to expand in what we call Dixie Alley, but it's also covering the area of the Great Lakes, which is why we're seeing an increase in tornadoes in the areas that we're starting to see those. And then the damage field from that being that we didn't build the infrastructure in that area the same way that we did in Tornado Alley. So when we look at best practices, that we're making sure that we're considering the other states who are already in this pain point, whether it's from microbursts, it's from derechos, it's from flash flooding events, from major cold snaps, all of these different weather events have all happened before historically. It's important to look at who sustained through them and how, and then make sure that we're changing the way we're considering resiliency based off that. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that graphic that kind of showcases each one of the critical infrastructure sectors and how heat kind of plays a role within that and what that looks like. The technology sector, the communication sector, chemicals, critical manufacturing, the dams and the waterways, the nuclear power plants, and emergency services. And so we're really able to see some of these different critical infrastructure sectors needing more water and not having access to water, not having access to energy at the same rate that they need to. Looking at some of those different impacts as far as being able to not only move materials, be able to create steel, to be able to move steel, to be able to mitigate the supply chain on that front. When we talk about all of these weather events, to make sure that we're also considering them through the critical infrastructure sectors, through the sites, the staff, security, society. If you go on to the next slide, I'm not sure if my slides are progressing on my end. Oh, awesome, there it is, sorry, yes. So that slide is the one that I was just speaking to, being able to be aware of what material you're operating with, whether it's concrete, cement mixture, what's the break point of that? How hot can that get before it becomes malleable, cracks, bends, warps? Same thing with some of your metals, same thing with the cell towers. They may be massive and able to withstand a lot of bad weather, but can they withstand all of that occurring so much more frequently? What happens when their baseline infrastructure starts to become more malleable, when it dimples out from subsidence is another big point. If you move on to the next slide, this one touches a little bit more about your infrastructure in the way of your operators. So being able to look at your security staff, can they still do rotations as frequently as they do? Do your sensors still work the way that they need to? If you have an outward facing keypad and that's in direct sunlight and it's 110 degrees outside, does that sensor end up warping out? Are you still able to utilize it? If there's a flood event, does that impede your ability to move cars in and out of your site? To be able to look at this as a malicious actor's activity as well, being able to look for people coming in on the back end of these disasters, claiming to click these links for resources or claiming the restoration crews, claiming they're with emergency response in any capacity. And what does that mean as we go forward when we start to look at what's going on the back end of some of these weather events? If you go into the next slide, this one touches a little bit more about our first responders. I like to make sure that this information's out there just so that we're aware of the stress and the strain that our first responders are really undergoing. So whether it's the high temperatures, the overheating of their gear, the rashes that they're experiencing from their gear swelling up, all of these different impacts, the heart attacks, the threats that we have for skin cancer for our firefighters out there, all of those come with cascading impacts that we have to take into consideration when we're doing emergency planning. I only have a couple more slides. So on the next slide, you're going to see some of these different impacts in the way of the human body and what does that look like for, again, not just your staff, but for the operators. If you go one more slide forward, the transportation side of the house also takes these same kind of pressure point hits. Aircraft can't carry as much. They don't get as much lift. Helicopters can't operate in extreme heat. The railway starts to warp. You need to run your trains slower. And with less cargo, you end up with the cargo ships moving along the waterways during drought, unable to carry as much. They have to operate slower so they don't bottom out. You end up with damaged roadways from the flood events, from the heat, from seismic activity that's triggered by aquifer collapse. You can see all of these cascading impacts across the entire transportation sector, causing delays in supply chain, causing impacts in sources being able to move along the supply chain, but also on staff being able to move along that chain. When you go on to the next slide, you can just see that this one's important to consider for the agricultural aspect. Our fruits and vegetables, our wheat, our ability to feed our populations, taking that hit. When we see where we're getting these temperatures, these winds, these hail events, the tornadoes, it's not just us, it's every country starting to report the major implications to the agricultural sector at the same time that we need so much water to be able to run energy, to be able to run our crypto, to be able to do all of these things. We also need it for agriculture. And to say that we're running out of water in some of these areas is obviously an immediate impact to the sustainability of the region, but also comes with the cascading impact of who on their supply chain imports or exports, and what does it look like if they undergo one of these major weather disasters. And then finally, our last two slides talk about damages to the human body in a different capacity. So if we go on to the next slide, looking at what it means to be under these high pressure heat wave days as a human being, you can start to see some of those impacts in the way of extreme violence. We're seeing an increase in domestic violence, in property damage, and violent crime, and terroristic attacks during high pressure days when it's very hot. We know that road rage incidents go up, and we know all of these things in the back end, but being able to trace them as the climate gets more unstable, so does the general society. But it's not just us, it's also the livestock, it's the wildlife becoming more violent, more aggressive, moving further into populated areas as well. If you go on to the next slide, which is really the last one for data, this is just to be able to showcase if we're expecting more aggression, we're expecting more violence, we're expecting more pain points. To secure. On to the second to last slide, this one just showcases the different ways that SISAS products there as of recent, working some of our different stakeholders, applications, data centers and extreme heat, and you're able to see some of the exercise products that you can solicit from the agency. And then finally on the last slide, that's just a contact slide if you want to get in touch with me at the back end of this while I'm not in the middle of apparently cellular connectivity issues on my own side. But that's everything from me. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you guys now.
Thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you for joining us. I know it seems that it's been tough. I'm glad it's not weather because that would have been too perfect. But we appreciate both of you spending the time to talk about the project a little bit in the future, and wanted to encourage everyone, if you have questions, please do enter them in the chat. But I will follow up with a little bit of what Dan was saying and ask a question of both of you. And that is, what are ways that governments might protect the public against cyber threats to systems that protect communities in the event of climate-related shocks? In an era where dams, bridges, tunnels, and waterways are controlled by technology. That certainly speaks to, Sunny, you talking about cascading events. We have seen terrorist attempts in the past to do multiple attacks as well. So there are a lot of things that our interconnectivity bring. It's good things and bad things.
Do you want me to start off with the answer to that?
Sure, absolutely. We've got you loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. So when we're talking about some of these interconnects and the different ways that the government can assist in any capacity, we look at things like our funding grants that we offer on the FEMA side of the house for building resilience in communities, the BRIC grants. There's ways to get information out even further. It's really an awareness message issue on my side of the house. When I go and I talk to the stakeholders or I talk to the communities and they say, I had no idea that this caused this problem. A lot of the times what they do is they end up mitigating for the symptoms and not the cause. And so you end up with that, you end up with a disconnect where everyone starts to feel out of control about the event, and that out of control nature can actually hinder progress. The last thing that they start to do in that moment is trigger creativity. And that's really what you want to do, is you want to scope your message to incentivize creative and innovative responses on the back end from people who might be experiencing it in a different way than what was originally thought of when I looked at some of these data sources, to say, domestic violence rates are going up, is it going up for the reason that it's hot in the house, or are these particular regions where they're experiencing this at a greater rate for other reasons? There's less availability of food. Maybe we could incentivize some of the districts to contribute more food to the households in this regard by donation. You can look at some different mitigation strategies all the way at that local level to the bigger levels of maybe people don't know what to do with the insurance rising with these damaging events. Working with your insurance providers as we go forward to say, what if you do resiliency methods like changing your roof type to a more metal roof? Does that reduce that cost and give you more money for you to be able to buy better food, to be able to run your AC at the rate that you need to? All of these cascading interlinks at the local level. So mine's all about messaging and making sure that they're aware that there are government resources, there are ways to engage our stakeholders in that way to move resiliency forward all at once.
Yeah, Christina, the question is an excellent one. I guess I'd underscore two things, and Sunny certainly, alluded to this both just a moment ago and then more broadly in her presentation. The first thing is, I think that's very important, is at the federal level to make sure that we are supplying tools, techniques, information down to partners at the state and local level. As Sunny showed, is that the effects of climate-related disasters are going to be very localized. We're kind of all going to be hit in a general sense, but all of her maps of the U.S. showed different colors all around the place, and then depending on the disaster, the colors changed quite dramatically. And so each local government is going to have to make its own decisions in terms of mitigation strategies and risk management in terms of adaptation. But at least at the federal level, what we can be doing is supplying information, be supplying methodology, tools and techniques that they can use, and then making sure that they have the capabilities to effectively use those tools that are being provided to them. The second, and then directly related to that, is that Sunny mentioned about the importance of grants. Is that one of the things that came out loud and clear to us, and we've seen this in other work as well, of course, is that we need to make sure that the grant making procedures that we have at the federal level are as streamlined as possible for those down at the local level. Far too often, local governments actually leave money on the table that is not applied for grants that they would otherwise be eligible for, simply because they don't have the capability in order to do that. They don't have the people in place or the knowledge to do that, or they have to hire a contractor. There's nothing that tells you that something is more wrong where a local government has to hire an outside third party to help them navigate the complex processes of the federal government in order to get resources that rightly should be down at the local level. So we need to make sure at the federal level that we have streamlined grant making process, sure, have the accountability in place, and make sure that there's all the documentation that's needed, but make sure that it's also that it's not excessive, that it's not overly burdensome to those that actually need that financial support down at the local level. One other thing is that you ought to really ask Dan this question as well, because he's an absolute expert on kind of cyber related issues, and he'd be a pro on this.
I've been around long enough to absorb information from experts like you. The other point that I'd make on this question relates to some of the data that Sunny pointed out around systemic effects, societal effects of climate incidents, around crime and social unrest. We're not the only ones that are seeing this data. Our adversaries can see this data as well. And you can only imagine that in an extreme heat event, if somebody had access to the power grid and could basically bring down a grid in a particular area of the country that's one of the areas that was red, let's say, on one of Sunny's charts, that could lead to significant unrest, and that adversaries could take advantage of that. So basic cyber hygiene and good protection of critical infrastructure, often called critical control systems, the systems that kind of underline the protections against things like extreme heat by providing energy, power, air conditioning in the winter, heating. That's also critically important in terms of cyber protection.
Well, and as a former president of InfraGard, InfraGard is a program that was started by the Federal Bureau of Investigation many years ago to share information to protect critical infrastructure. And that piece has proven time and time again that making sure that government and industry and stakeholders are communicating, and particularly with attacks. As president, we established several programs that helped critical infrastructure sectors develop listservs and information sharing portals so that if a hospital was being attacked in Georgia and they knew it, they could get on that portal and share that information and tell people, these are the kinds of attacks we're seeing, this is what's happening, in a very private way. We still have a long way to go on that type of information sharing where it's really on the ground and you can really get real-time information as opposed to finding out on CNN. But that type of sharing, and of course, the FBI using that as a way to share the things they're seeing as well, that cross communication is incredibly important. So to a next
Christina,
question,
can I
yes.
jump in there on that and
Yes,
just say
please.
that, that is such a powerful example, because what you showed there and what you did there was you showed that, the advantage of just basic information sharing, and it can be relatively low tech how you do that, a listserv, as you said back in the day, and yet it can have enormous benefits to the participants involved. And so it doesn't all have to be very big and elaborate and systems building before you start getting some real advantages from just sharing information, talking to one another, building relationships of trust across jurisdictions. That's really where you begin to start seeing some just enormous impact, as your example showed.
As a matter of fact, the more complicated you make it, the fewer people use it. So, I mean, it has to be log in, share information, and be able to. And that's, so the legal issues, and there are a lot of challenges around sharing information, but we have to wade through that, because I was an advocate of, it's better we share it and say sorry later than not share it and have it turn out to be catastrophic. So, yeah. So the next question we have, how might AI enable better preparation and response to support sustainability given the near and long-term effects of climate change? This is on top of everyone's mind. How are we going to leverage AI to benefit us, not just scare us?
Actually, sorry,
ahead.
do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
All right, so I was going to say that there's a good use case to be able to integrate AI when we talk about leaning backwards and utilizing some of these historics to really see what's changing and where it's changing. I know everybody wants to lean really far forward on using AI to jump into forecasting. And there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had on how you train it, what data you're utilizing, how to prevent the hallucinations. But when you do historic review, you're able to mass evaluate giant aggregates of data to be able to get it synthesized down into a meaningful amount of information to say, low pressures are changing in this way, they're this slow now, they were this fast before. That means that this infrastructure in this region is just not prepared for the speed and the intensity of it. You can sort of utilize it to do this correlatable, research. And personally, that's what I'm utilizing it for right now, is to be able to say, how deep are lows getting in comparison to before? How much slower are they getting? How much more time under high pressures are we spending? And what does that look like when we talk about planning for the future? What resources maybe sustain the best in these heat waves, and how much would it be to move them into the region, which AI can also help with?
Christina, part of this also came as a result. We did a roundtable in Helsinki on this topic of climate sustainability and resilience, and the use of AI to kind of get ahead, in an area of the world where climate change is leading to significant changes in the flora and fauna of, the Nordics, and significant changes in terms of geopolitical shifts in the Arctic Circle around different national interests and resources. AI can help sort of model what's happening at sort of a long-term level and provide for better predictability and different sort of scenarios for sustainable outcomes, and also kind of take a look at, in the nearer term, sort of what are the patterns that have led to different effects that are going to affect nations in northern regions, and this includes, of course, Alaska in the U.S. With similar interests and issues. And so there's sort of a modeling element of here that AI can help with that came out in that roundtable.
And Christina, the only thing that I would add, fully agreeing with both Sunny and Dan on this, is that this is a perfect example of one of those situations where the federal government needs to be supporting local governments and state and local governments. Is that we can't expect every local government, and many of them are really quite small, these small local governments, to have their own modeling capacity, or to develop it independently. It's something where there needs to be a knowledge transfer from the federal down to the state and the local levels in order to support their needs.
Absolutely. I think the other thing, and I think 3 of the 4 of us will remember this, the Mount St. Helens eruption. I'm enough of a geek that I watched a documentary about it last night. And one of the things that struck me is with AI modeling the interdependencies. I mean, I know that interdependencies for the last decade or so have been it's been the buzzword because we realize all the cascading effects, and hopefully AI can help us model some of those better, because even back then, you know, they talked about, oh, we expected XYZ, but the cascading effects, the mud, the flooding, that wasn't as expected and caused much more damage than the worst case scenario that they had developed. So hopefully AI can take us to a place where we can model intelligently, but model much more effectively than perhaps in the past. So yeah, this has been amazing. I think I could talk to you all day, but we have 3 more minutes left, and I don't see any questions from the audience. So what I'll do is thank all of you very much. This has been a tremendous first webinar in our series. Dan, what do you think?
Terrific. I could listen to Sunny and Chris all day long.
Me too. So thank you all for your time, and thank you for your work on this, because these are the founding principles for the future. And whether we like it or not, we have to focus. So I will do a little plug for Homeland Security today's Climate Security Quarterly. We do a quarterly focused on climate security, but really for practitioners. So it is not a we love the trees or the trees are important type newsletter. There are lots of those out there, but it's a true focus on facilities, on rising coastal waters, on true impacts to emergency management and Homeland Security professionals and how they can mitigate those challenges. So we encourage you to sign up for that. They're free, again, a quarterly. So hstoday.us. Thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to our next webinar with you and your team, Dan. Thank you all.